said the most economical was about an hour and 15 minutes. Maybe more like 2.5. By the way, you said Florida. Is there any way of telling what region of Florida?
It's at the police station, first floor meeting room.
I'm sorry?
All right.
South Florida.
Thank you. Bye.
East Coast, West Coast?
I'd have to find that.
Because they have an operation on the East Coast, I think, somewhere in Orlando or something.
You know what?
I think Melbourne. That's what I read at lunchtime.
I did feed you. I don't know. I don't think you do it anymore. How I used to.
I don't know if you saw, but we had a corn field in
Do they do that anymore?
coffee machine in it.
No, I think
Big nap.
I won't bring it up. That's good. I just wanted you to know that
I feel sorry for it because if it is that bad, it's wrong. It's just what it is supposed to think and
Thanks. Good, how you doing?
I'm not connected to the internet, and yet I can get on my computer. Mechanical and not anything. Are we expecting plans or something?
I think so. Oh, hi. Very nice to meet you. Welcome aboard.
I'm sorry, Jim.
Hi.
Today's the first day, so we said, well,
Come on down. Have some fun.
before we leave, I want to run something by you about the day we will
Hey, Mr. Scudder? Oh, for the Scudders, yeah. I was going to offer my sympathy to the loss of their brother. Please convey that to me. Thank you. The brother was not involved with the boat, though, right? Oh, it was? What part of the obituary didn't sound like it was? Oh, okay. 6'5"? No, he's up there. No. It's too bad, yeah.
30 seconds. 30 seconds. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Mr. Flanzer.
Hi. I'm organizing, sorry.
I won't want to get in the way of that. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Special Airport Commission meeting of May 6, 2014. You have before you the agenda. Are there any comments? Before we get into the main part of the meeting, is there general public comment, not on subjects that are specifically on the agenda? Hearing none, we'll move on. We've got a couple of pending leases and contracts to look at very briefly. Mr. Rafter, please.
The first is the lease with the TSA. You may recall they had asked for an extension, and we went back and said we would as long as there was a CPI in it, and they agreed to the CPI. So the difference will be the $4,450. So we're asking for your approval for that. And if you want to do one
Do
at a
them
time.
separately.
Okay.
Is there a motion to approve the grant with the, I'm sorry, this is
It's a
TSA,
lease,
lease with the TSA, excuse me.
I'll make a motion to approve the lease with the TSA as described on Exhibit 1.
there a second?
I'll second.
Any questions? Comments? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye, it's unanimous, thank you. The second one?
This is a grant with, from MassDOT, Division of Aeronautics, for the Taxiway Delta project, and I believe this is closing it out. We received a bill, and this is an extra grant to cover that.
A motion to approve?
I'll make that motion.
Is there a second? Any questions or comments? Mr. Gasparo? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Carried unanimously. I forgot to mention at the outset that this meeting is being recorded and televised. The next subject is the discussion of proposed comments on the action of the Steamship Authority to approve Highline service changes and possible action thereon. This was prompted by the notice in the paper, which unfortunately, at least I did not see the first week it was in the paper. I only saw it last week. And that's why there's been a bit of haste surrounding this, because the Steamship Authority's notice for comments asked that comments be returned by Friday the 9th. And in addition, the Board of Selectmen has scheduled an agenda item on this matter for tomorrow night. So we needed to take some action or not, as the case may be. And so we'll go right into it. And I think what I will do first is, have some discussion amongst the commission about the issue, and then ask. We have representatives of both the Steamship Authority and the Highline here with us today, who I believe would like to say something, as they should be able to. And so we'll ask them to jump in and then come back to discussion. I have prepared a draft letter, which, I think is pretty obvious, reflects my views on this, but it's obviously up to the commission to determine what it wants to do. But I prepared the letter really and got it out slightly ahead of the meeting for discussion purposes, because I thought we needed a basis from which to start out. And let me just say that where I believe, I believe that the Airport Commission is charged with, looking out for its best interests and the best interests of its tenants and providing transportation services to the island, whether it be from the Cape or from New York or anywhere else. And that when an issue comes up that could have an impact, and particularly a negative impact on those tenants, that we have a responsibility at least to discuss it and decide whether we are going to take any action with respect to it. The issue here is whether the proposed amendment to the Highline license by the Steamship Authority is something that we feel will impact the airport and its tenants. And I think that's the first question we have to answer. And then the second question is, if it does, if we do determine that it will affect the airport and its tenants, then we have to determine whether there's a course of action that we can and should take. Ironically, the last master plan for the airport was done in 1995, I believe, and updated in 1998. And acknowledged the fact that both the Steamship Authority and the Highline were in the process of starting high-speed ferry services to the island. And I think, if I can find it here, it may be worth reading a very brief excerpt from that master plan. Excuse me just a second. This is from the Phase 2 Master Plan update for the Nantucket Memorial Airport in October 1988, prepared for the Airport Commission by Edwards and Kelsey, which is a predecessor firm of the firm of Jacobs, which is now doing an update to our master plan. And there's a section entitled Relationship to the High-Speed Ferry. And in summary, basically, the advisory committee for the master plan discussed two key issues: the Steamship Authority's estimates for trip diversions to the high-speed ferry and consistency with the comprehensive plan objectives for the airport. Based upon that, the discussions at that session and subsequent employment statistics, it was determined that the potential loss of 25,000 employments that had been estimated by the SSA was overstated, which I think is particularly telling, because some of the statistics that we have, even though they aren't very good, show that the Steamship Authority underestimated the diversion, and the airport underestimated it even more. There was a discussion about levels of service, time pressure, price insensitivity, and so on. But it's I think the fact that this was an issue that was discussed and recognized back then, almost close to 20 years ago, is indicative of the fact that it was a concern then, and could well be a concern now. I would welcome comments from the rest of the commission at this point in terms of their thinking as to whether this is something we should take action on, and then we'll go from there.
I think we should, in that I'm surprised, like almost 200 more passengers coming over, and I think if I remember reading the article in the newspaper, more trips, and that's really going to be doing worse number on the airport as far as I'm concerned. But I have a question, if I may,
I may ask you to
hold on.
No,
okay.
Ask the question, but
okay.
hold
well,
on the answer.
I'm surprised that it says it would retire the Martha's Vineyard Great Point, which has a capacity of 720 passengers. Is that in one trip? It has capacity for 720? That's my question. Maybe go to the microphone.
Yeah, Mr. Why don't you hold off for just a minute, and then we'll come back. Yeah, it will be, but let's.
My thoughts or remembrance of this being passed was when Mrs. Grossman got up and said we would save some of the cars coming to the island, and so that was probably the main reason for us to now try to increase the numbers coming. I just don't feel that it should be going that high, personally. Thank you.
Anybody else want to comment at this point?
Well, I read the letter right before we came in. We just got the letter. So I find it understandable. I have a couple of questions, though. I think we spend a lot of time as the Airport Commission looking into what the ferry should do. I think we should take a look to write a letter, but the letter is to our Board of Selectmen for them to look at an overall transportation policy. I think the deployment decrease has lots of reasons for those things to occur. You have two portals. You have the sea and the air, and the two of them are used as services by the community, the year-round community in particular on the Hyannis route, and then again increased specifically on the summer residents. What I'd like to understand is what is it that we're asking for, Mr. Chairman? What would we like to do? I don't think it's in our best interest to be a commission of no that says we don't have the right capabilities in our own hands, so therefore we're going to put restrictions on the other portal of access to the island. We should be focusing on what we can do to improve the quality of experience from the aviation standpoint, from the airport, and for the community. I do think that it appears to me, as the newest member of the commission, that we're missing an overall transportation policy. And I know there's a lot of concern about the parking at fairgrounds. I know there's a lot of concern of the vehicles downtown. There are things we can do to help that. I don't like the letter being a negative to another entity. I think we should look to work within ourselves to create a value experience for the community. And I think we should work with the Board of Selectmen to ask their assistance, along with the Steamship Authority and Highline, to take a look at what's the best mix and let the free market determine which is the most capable. So my concern is not whether we write a letter, but what we're going to put into the letter. And in some cases, I thought the resolutions were a little stronger, directing other people to do things that we should have in our own experience. With due respect to the Board of Selectmen, I wouldn't particularly want them to tell us how we should handle this. I would like us to take a look on what our issues are and how we would handle it. So, not opposed to a letter, but would like the clarity on what we're asking as an outcome of the letter, and that it's easy to write.
Thank you. Anybody else? Mr. Gasparo?
Yes, I would say that I am generally supportive of the letter, and it struck me in the first couple of pages, similar to Mr. Flanzer, that perhaps it was a bit negative until I got to the resolves part. And then I felt better because it wasn't just saying no, it was setting out a chance to have everybody come and look at the policy. And that's what the resolutions really ask, is not to just say no, but to not just say yes right now either, and to take a period of time for the overall town of Nantucket. We have a transportation planner who I believe should be very actively engaged in this process as well. And that's why, in general, I am supportive of the letter. But that's really where I'm coming from, is that we need a little more time, a little more planning, and that such a decision should not just be made in haste. And while this letter is, in our position, has to come together rather quickly, it's to meet a comment deadline. And I hope that ultimately that the Steamship Board will also choose to hold the hearings on Nantucket. I know that this letter says either of the communities, perhaps even both of the communities, but that really the impacted communities are Hyannis, Barnstable, as well as Nantucket. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I think the letter makes some assumptions that possibly just aren't true, that the increase in the number of passengers that Highline can take in the peak period is going to take away passengers. I don't think that that's necessarily true. I think people make decisions not by space available, but number one, the cost. And the airlines will have to be the ones to compete with that. And the overall service, not just, because it's not only the cost, but it's also the schedule. And people would choose first by cost, probably by schedule. What gets them over there at the right time? So if the ferry doesn't provide that, then they would fly. Flying costs more. And especially like families, when you've got a multiple group, it adds up a lot more. So it's more cost elastic, I guess. So we're making that assumption in here, that would necessarily take away. And I think there are other things we can look at, like the parking issue, possibly do something, a policy around that, or an overall transportation policy, I guess, instead of picking out and making assumptions that this would necessarily take away from us.
Thank you. Mr. Ranney, Robert Ranney is the town's appointed representative to the Board of Governors of the Steamship Authority, and has very kindly, along with some of his colleagues and associates, come today. And I think I'm going to look to you as to how you would like to have the position of the Highline and or the Steamship Authority presented to this, whether you'd like this Highline to go first, whether you'd like to say anything. How would you like to handle it? If you'd go to the microphone and identify yourself, please. I'm sorry about the microphone setup here, but it's the way it is.
I'm Rob Ranney. I am, as Dan said, the Nantucket's representative to the Steamship Authority Governing Board. I've brought with me today Steve Sayers, who is the general counsel for the Steamship. We are, as Dan said, in the middle of the public comment period for the licensing for the Highline's request to build a new boat and add another fast ferry to this route. I think probably it would be best if maybe Steve came up and gave a brief sort of overview of how we've gotten to this point as far as this request by Highline has come about and how, the reason why we're here.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Sayers, would you identify yourself, please?
Yes, my name is Steve Sayers, and I am General Counsel for the Steamship Authority. A few months ago, Highline did approach us about getting permission. We are the regulators of all the private ferry operators between the mainland of Massachusetts and the islands of Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard, if they carry in excess of 40 passengers of Coast Guide certified capacity per trip. So Highline is one of our private carriers that we license in order to carry more than their grandfathered. They are a grandfathered carrier under our Enabling Act, which means they are allowed to operate a certain number of trips per day during certain times of the year. They haven't operated that small number of trips since I think it's probably 1988, which is when we began licensing them to provide greater capacity.
Excuse me, Mr. Sayers, did that initial licensing, include passenger capacity as well as schedule?
Yes, it included the ability to build the Great Point. The Great Point did not exist at the time of the grandfathering provision took place, I think, in 1974. Highline built the Great Point in the late 1980s, and they needed a license from us in order to operate that boat because it did have substantially greater capacity than its predecessor vessels. We began licensing them in the late 1980s with more and more trips. They then started to operate the high-speed boat, which I think everyone agrees is a much-needed adjunct of life on the island of Nantucket now. I don't think there are only a few of us who could remember a time without the high-speed ferry and not being able to get back except either staying overnight here or for you, undoubtedly staying overnight on the mainland. They started that in 1995 without a license from us. They carried fewer than 40 passengers per trip, and they then came the following year and asked us for a license. It was always tense. We were facing the same issues that we are facing today and you're facing as well, and we had to balance a lot of interest at that time. We gave them a license to carry more passengers on the Gray Lady. That original boat was too small for the route, so they built the Gray Lady 2, which had a greater capacity, up to 149 passengers. That has since been renamed the Lady Martha. That's making trips to Martha's Vineyard from Hyannis. And then in around the early 2000s, they built the Gray Lady 3, which is now known as the current Gray Lady, which has a capacity of 300 passengers. Over the course of the last decade, we have increased the capacity that they are able to carry on that boat. It's now up to its Coast Guard certified capacity of 300 passengers, and the number of trips that they're able to operate at all times of the year. Essentially, we have said you can operate the Gray Lady as much as you want because it's more of a business decision as to meeting the demand that is there at any particular time. And we get a license fee because the Enabling Act makes it clear that we have to sustain the necessities of life to the island. And so because the more that they do carry, we have gone through great analysis over the last decade, it stands to reason we will be carrying fewer passengers to the extent they carry more, unless the market grows, that would be more than what either of us is carrying at the time. So we've developed license fee formulas over the last decade, which we've all agreed to with Highline, to compensate us for a portion of the revenues that we're losing. It's not potentially 25% or even less than what we're losing, but we feel that on balance, the good for the island is worth it, that the island receives this service.
Excuse me, how do you define the revenues you're losing?
We look at our passenger revenues. Mm-hmm. To use a bad phrase, the original service model of ferry service was that you have one boat that carries three types of passengers: freight, automobiles, and passengers. And revenues from all three of those markets contributes to the cost of that boat. As you start to lose the passenger market to the high-speed boat, which has to have its own ferry, the remaining cost, the vessel costs remain the same, so you either have to increase rates in order to pay for that cost, or you get some compensation from the high-speed boat in order to fund that stuff. And we've done a combination of both over the years. Highline has paid its license fees in order to compensate us for the revenues that we're losing by having more people go to the high speed. And it's never an easy negotiation. There are interests on all sides. We have determined there is a public necessity and convenience for this service, and it does appear, based upon the traffic counts that we maintain, that there is an increasing demand for the service during the months of July and August. Not as much during the other times of the year, potentially during the festival weekends, Daffodil Weekend, the Christmas Stroll Weekend, I think even the Nantucket Wine Festival Weekend. There isn't as much of a demand increase during the other times of the year, except that it would be financially unsound to have someone build a boat and have it only operate for 2 months out of the year. So you have to make some accommodation in how they operate their business. I'm sorry, sir.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Highline came to us a few months ago to ask about building the second boat. We looked at the situation. The management has concluded that there is this limited need for the additional boat, and that we would be recommending to the board, at least our current recommendation is that they allow the licensing request to be granted with some conditions on it. That will be presented to our board next week, unless there is public comment, which is the reason we're here today and the reason we put public notice, unless things come up in the public arena that we haven't considered, that we think are certainly worthy of consideration, and either postponing that decision to investigate it or changing our conclusion.
Have you, as part of your analysis this time around, considered what impact this might have on employment?
We have not.
Thank you.
At least that's a direct answer.
It is. Thank you. I appreciate it. Does anybody have any questions for Mr. Sayers at this time? Thank you, sir, very much.
Maybe I should stay here in case.
Probably good. That'd be a good idea.
One other small point. I do answer to the Board of Selectmen. So if you were to go forward with perhaps a letter to the board, I'm the one that carries that forward to the steamship.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Mr. Riley, would you identify yourself and...
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Chairman Drake, and members of the Commission, for giving me an opportunity to provide, I hope, some clarification on the Highline proposal. For the record, my name is Martin T. Riley, and I am here today representing Highline Cruises in my capacity as Director of Public Affairs and Business Development for Highline. In an effort to better serve the island of Nantucket and the traveling public, and meet the increasing demands of public convenience and necessity, Highline is requesting approval from the Steamship Authority to replace our traditional vessel, the Great Point, which has a capacity of 720 passengers per trip, with a new high-speed vessel, which will have a capacity for 439 seats, as a new modern high-speed ferry to replace the traditional somewhat antiquated ferry. I think a history of Highline's high-speed service might be helpful and enlightening, to the members of the Commission as well as to the citizenry and the people of Nantucket. In late 1995, in an effort to promote better service to the island of Nantucket and the traveling public, Highline initiated and pioneered the introduction of high-speed ferry service from Hyannis to the island of Nantucket. The steamship followed in 1998 with their first high-speed vessel. And since that time, through subsequent expansions that we've received, working with the Steamship Authority, our high-speed ferry service, the Gray Lady 2, which you might recall, which has now been called Lady Martha, and that was in 1997. And then because of the continuing growing demand for the market, in 2001 we built what we called the Gray Lady 3, which is now known as the Gray Lady. Highline, through that process, working with the authority, has really become an integral part of the year-round public-private ferry transportation system, providing service to the people of Nantucket and visitors and people going to and from the mainland. The proposal that we are considering today, which is before you, calls for replacing the traditional antiquated vessel, the Great Point, with a 720-seat passenger capacity, with a new modern high-speed ferry with a lesser capacity, a 439-seat passenger capacity. 329 seats will be interior seats, 169 seats will be on the exterior. It's important to note in this proposal, and I think it may be helpful to the Commission today and to the people in the town, is that this is not an increase in service, but rather it's a change in the mode of service and the mode of travel to meet the increasing demands of public convenience and necessity on the island. Highline presently runs 6 trips on our high-speed Gray Lady, and we run 3 trips on our traditional vessel, the Great Point. Under this proposal, we're going to continue to run only 9 trips, 5 of which would be high-speed with the new Gray Lady, and 4 of which would be high-speed on the present Gray Lady. Also, it's important to point out to the Commission and to the community that Highline needs new equipment and a better, more modern vessel mix to best serve the public interest of Nantucket residents and the traveling public. The Gray Lady has been running almost continuously for over 10 years, with exception of being out of service at the shipyard. Lady Martha, for those of you that may have traveled on Lady Martha, served the island well in its early years, but really now is an inadequate vessel to serve the island of Nantucket in the winter months. It's not that seaworthy or reliable. So we really need to take that vessel out of the mix in the best interest of providing the best possible service to Nantucket. The new vessel, or the new high-speed vessel, will be more seaworthy, more comfortable, more convenient for passengers, and we think it will really enhance the quality of ferry service that's offered to the people of Nantucket, similar to the quality of air service that the people get from Nantucket with the new air terminal that you have and the fine service that's run by the airlines. The other thing I want to point out is the changes in technology. You know, with the changes in technology and the advances in technology and the evolution of technology, the preferred mode of travel for the consumer, whether it's a resident of the island or whether it's someone visiting the island, is really high speed. People want to get to and from the island more frequently, not to take as long given the changes that we've seen in our lifestyles over the many, many years. And it's similar to other advances in transportation technology over the years. It would be almost analogous to, you know, the horse and carriage, the automobile, the airplane. It just wouldn't make sense for Highline to have to replace a traditional antiquated vessel with something that's not of the modern technology and the high-speed technology, which is really what the public wants. So another factor that I wanted to point out is tourism. Tourism has become so much the lifeblood of Nantucket as the island becomes more of a year-round destination. You know, the great job the Chamber's done extending the season with Daffodil Week and Wine Festival, you know, the active summer months, the fall activities, the Christmas stroll. And as Nantucket becomes more of a year-round destination with things they're doing at the Dreamland to bring people in and other things, it's really, it's so important that we offer the best possible mode of not only airplane service, but also ferry service for the people of the island and visitors, commensurate with the technology that exists. So, you know, for all of these reasons, coupled with the fact that it really is the best time to build so that we can keep the prices as stable as possible for the island. You know, interest rates are very low. There's changes that are being looked at in the industry now in terms of the type of engine that you have to put in, which can also be much more costlier. So for all of these reasons, I would respectfully ask that, knowing that it's really not an increase in service, but rather a change in the mode of service and travel, that we're asking the Steamship Authority to proceed without delay to allow us to go forward with this new vessel in the best interest of the island. And I would respectfully ask that if the Commission knowing some of these facts, could be more open to supporting that possibility. And I do agree as well that I think the suggestion of developing a comprehensive transportation plan for Nantucket would be fantastic, and we'd love to be part of that. So I thank you for the opportunity to be here today and present some testimony and shed some light on our proposal. And the support that we've received from the island for this is tremendous. There's been a tremendous amount of support expressed in letters and other emails and things of that nature from a diverse group of people here on the island and others. And we hope that we can be successful and move this forward in the best interest of providing the best service to the people in Nantucket going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Riley. Just a minute, Mr. Sayers, if I may. Is there questions from the members of the commission? I have a couple, if I may, Mr. Riley. Have you done an analysis? You carry, as I gather, approximately 70,000 passengers per season on the Great Point, the slow ferry. I assume by 70,000, those are essentially round trips, or are they one way?
Those are one-way trips.
Those are one-way trips. So you're basically bringing 35,000 people to the island and back in simpler, yeah, of course, but in the simplest terms, that's what's happening. Have you done any study on whether that base of customers, which I presume is mostly tourists, and if I'm not correct on that, let me know, whether they would be inclined to move over to your high-speed ferry service, or whether they might be inclined to be pushed over to the steamship slow ferry?
Thank you. It's a difficult question to answer with definitive certainty, but we think that, again, because of the preference of the consumer to take the high speed as opposed to the traditional boat, we think and hope that many of our approximately 70,000 people that use our traditional boats presently would take our new Highline boat. We think that also some of them will take the Steamship Authority boat, because as you know, the Steamship has a pricing policy. I think it's Mondays through Thursday, I believe it is, Steve. That's $50 a ticket. Our traditional boat is $46 a ticket. So I think the Steamship Authority will pick up some of those people. And then the other component of the business, I think, by statute, as we all know, the Steamship Authority has a mandate to provide for the goods and services and the conveyance of passengers at a fair price, so that traditional trip will always be available to the people on Nantucket who would prefer to go on the slower boat, because it's required by statute. So it's really the public-private partnership that we have been able to work within for the town of Nantucket, and has really been very positive for the system. As I say, we took the initial risk and innovation and introduced high-speed service in 1995, and I think it's been very, very helpful to the island. The Steamship followed, I think, in 1998 or 1999 with their first high-speed boat, the Finest, I believe it was, and it was followed by the Flying Cloud, and now the Iano. We followed with our second boat in 1997, the Gray Lady 2, and then the Gray Lady, and now, again, because of the demands of the growth in the market and the preference for the people to take the high-speed boat, this is something that's very badly needed and wanted in the island. Again, I think the Steamship will pick up most of that. We hope we pick up, on the traditional side, they'll pick up all of that. We will hope to pick up a lot of the other travelers, and some will go to the Authority.
But what you're saying, in theory at least, is that this could be a win-win for both the Steamship and the Highline.
That's what we're hopeful. And, as Steve Sayers said, one of the things through this public-private partnership, where we become the year-round provider of high-speed service and an integral part of the system, we pay the Authority a significant amount of license fee revenue. And I think what it does is it allows the island to have better service at a lesser cost than possibly if the public entity were to have gone out and built the new vessel. So it's a good system, and I think the system really does need this third vessel, with us retiring our traditional slower boat and also taking the Gray Lady and the Lady Martha out of the mix in the winter. I think it's going to be much better for
You just segued into my second question, which is, would it be Highline's intention to use the new vessel as the primary boat on the Nantucket run in the off-season?
Our new vessel will, again, our vessel mix in the summer months will continue to run the same number of trips that we run now. We presently run 6 on the high-speed, 3 on the traditional. We'll run 5 on the new high-speed boat and 4 on the Gray Lady. I think what we're going to do is we'll probably rotate the boats. Again, Murray Scudder, who's more involved in the operations, can speak to that greater than I. But I think the present Gray Lady will be used in place thereof of the Lady Martha, which will be a substantial...
So more or less the backup.
Yeah, it'll be the backup, and it'll be a substantial enhancement. But in the winter months, I'm pretty sure that there'll be a mix of the two, but it'll be far superior service with Lady Martha.
You mentioned that on the new boat, and I don't remember the exact number you said, but of the 439 seats, how many are outside?
Yeah, of the 439 seats, I got to look at my notes here. Yeah.
169. All right, thank you.
Yeah, 169 the exterior.
In the wintertime, effectively, is the capacity of the boat, would the capacity of the Highline be increased by using that new boat?
I will tell you, it will in the sense that whether it's the Gray Lady, which has a 300-seat capacity,
Right.
or whether it's a new vessel, it would be better than the 149 passengers, which the Lady Martha presently can only take.
I understand that, but in terms of
well,
I'm sorry, my question was in terms of a particular trip. Now you have the Gray Lady 3, or the present Gray Lady, that
Yes.
has a 300-seat capacity, of which, how many are outside on that one?
I'm not certain of the outside,
Okay.
but it's not adequate. It's in bad weather, it's uncomfortable for the passengers. It's really not that comfortable. It's not too seaworthy anymore either.
Essentially, on a per-trip basis, when the new vessel's in service, it will substantially increase the capacity of...
It will, to meet public convenience and necessity, the demands of public convenience and necessity, because right now we get so many cancellations of the Lady Martha, which is full or in bad weather. It's not a very pleasant ride sometimes over for the people on the island, and we've got an increasing number of school groups and sports teams that are going over. People go over for doctor's visits. So with the increased demand, it's so badly needed to provide a more comfortable ride for the people. So it'll be a very positive improvement.
Thank you, sir. Any other questions for Mr. Riley? Mr. Sayers, did you have something else you'd like to say?
Yes, I would be remiss, I didn't mention all of our considerations. When management has analyzed this, one of the reasons that we are recommending to the board, at least at this moment, that they approve this request was for the additional demand that's needed during the months of July and August and at other times of the year. Another reason is because Highline does operate the only year-round high-speed ferry service at this time. And in order to do that, the Gray Lady has been on the run for a long time. And when the Gray Lady is taken off the run for service, which all of our boats have to be done on an annual basis, and the Gray Lady has to be done as well, that the Lady Martha, we have been told by many Nantucketers, is inadequate for this route, especially during the...
I don't think anybody's disputing that.
Okay, all right.
Nobody here is in a position to judge whether the Lady Martha is seaworthy or anything else.
But that's another important element, because at this point, Highline is under pressure to have the Gray Lady out of service for as little time as possible, and so their annual overhauls are compressed. Mm-hmm. And by having two comparable high-speed boats on the route, they can have periods of 2 months each, potentially, to have each boat overhauled, and therefore extend the useful life of both boats over the course of their service.
Thank you. But it is a conscious choice by the Steamship Authority, is it not, to allow the Highline to have that year-round service?
It is. It's a balancing of a number of competing interests that we have made. The other aspect, and there is one thing, the EPA Tier 3 versus Tier 4 engine requirements. We have come under that as well with our new freight boat, which we are going to have to put in MTU engines to meet the Tier 3 requirements before the Tier 4 requirements go into effect a year or so later. Therefore, there is a time element in here that Highline, if it's going to build the new boat with the far less expensive Tier 3 engines, will need to lay the keel of that boat probably sometime within the next year. I'm just saying that because I think the idea of having a transportation plan may be a terrific idea, and it well is, but whether to hold up all decisions and having in effect a moratorium may result in a number of increased costs for Highline, which would presumably be passed on to the traveling public.
Well, as you understand, all we can do is ask. We can't direct. We can't. All we can do is ask.
But you might get what you asked for.
Well,
So I just mentioned that could be an unintended consequence of asking for a moratorium at this point. Although I don't know. I'm just saying that's a consideration that we should look into.
So, Mr. Sayers, if I may, since I raised the issue of the overall transportation policy for the island, that doesn't put a stop to normal progression of events, products. That would be a decision that would come out of another area of public meetings in the Board of Selectmen, the hearings that you do. I just feel as though the island would be better served, especially the year-round residents, if we had an overall transportation policy. And when I said that, I was not indicating that should be, before that is done, we should stop everything we're doing, whether it's new airplanes for the commercial tenants at the airport, or whether it was new boats for the Steamship Authority or for Highline. Okay, just for clarity.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Sparrow?
I had one question for Mr. Sayers. You had mentioned that your recommendation to the board included certain conditions, and I was wondering if you might be able to elaborate on some of those.
One of the conditions that we've asked is that the scheduling of the Highline's high-speed ferries not be too close to our departures of our own ferry, in order to give the public more of a choice during the time of day that they depart. So we have asked that neither of Highline's two high-speed ferries depart closer than a half hour before ours or 15 minutes after ours. And that way, what we would call, in the vernacular, the poaching of our passengers would be decreased a little bit, because we would still have boats that leave at a certain time, and at the same time, the public would have more choice during the times of day that it would depart. Mm-hmm. Another one is that if, I would have to check all the conditions, but the license fee formula is one that we've worked on substantially. We had a license fee formula in effect for several years based upon our estimate of the diversion of our revenues. Highline's current passenger counts have exceeded the uppermost portion of that formula, and is becoming a significant number that exceeded our estimates. But because of the cost of the new boat that Highline is going to be incurring, we understand that there is a cost, that we are recommending that actually our license fees decrease for the first 2 years of the new license, because it's going to take a while we expect it's going to take a while for the additional passengers that Highline carries to be created in order to pay back start to pay back the cost of that vessel. So we're making that recommendation as well.
Thank you. Any other questions for the group? Mr. Lowell?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Would you identify yourself, please?
Nat Lowell, Port Counsel for the Nantucket Steamship, Nantucket member for the Steamship. I'm going to give you a little sort of a kind of a, because I've been around longer now than anyone else. It's kind of scary. This is an old issue. This isn't new. This has been going on a long time. I remember walking over to the window at a meeting upstairs we were having with management at the boat, and said, looked out the window and saw the brand new Flying Cloud, and I said, you know, that's the slow boat now. The fast boat is now the slow boat, and the slow boat is the Mayflower. Okay? But it took a long time for this to happen. And when the airlines were cranking back and forth to Hyannis, the fast ferries were barely operating. I mean, they had the first boat. Steamship didn't even have one. So it was either the slow boat or flying. So there's a lot of people coming over here to work on a plane. You're certainly not taking the Eagle at 9:15 to work, right? I just want to check. So we're a lot closer than we were 15 years ago. Nantucket got lifted out of the water and moved a lot closer to the Cape. That's the way it really is now, okay? So I like to look at things from a reality perspective instead of all these numbers and projections. In reality, what Marty was just saying, we don't know where the people are going to go. Nobody knows. But I can tell you this. We're hitting a reset button when this happens, and we've been doing it for a long time. We just never really looked at it that way. When the Highline built the Gray Lady that they're using now, that was a reset button for the passenger, for the traveling public in 2000. When we built, forget the Flying Cloud, I like to not talk about the Flying Cloud. Talk about an albatross, that was. The Edsel. When we built the INO, that was a reset button for the traveling public, again, in 2007. This is another reset button. The other thing that was briefly mentioned, and I want to make sure that we all understand this. I graduated high school in 1980. I didn't go to high school in Nantucket. There was no baseball. Was one of the reasons I didn't go to high school here. Baseball started here in 1980. You think that we have more than baseball now? Those sports teams are reliant on both fast ferries at $7 a kid. Just like our seasonal residents paying all the bills on Nantucket, the traveling public is paying for those sports teams to and from, meaning the other teams, the mainland teams, couldn't afford to come here and play and have our kids have the ability to have the same as an off-island team would have if we didn't have the revenue stream that we have with the summer cars that we all like to complain about and the people that aren't buying commuter books for the fast ferries. That's what's paying the bills, okay? Another thing I want to bring up is natural market share. Dan, and we've talked about this on and off television. I want to say something about this transportation policy. I'm not in favor of it, but that's just me. And the reason I'm not is because do we have a restaurant policy on Nantucket? We have like 80 restaurants on Nantucket. They all close and open on their own because they know what the market needs and what it doesn't. Some restaurants don't open for Wine Festival. Some do. Some open at Daffodil, some don't. Some close before Stroll and say, you know what, we're not waiting for Stroll weekend. We're closing. Some don't. Nobody tells them to do it. It just happens by itself. Well, I'll tell you something else that happens by itself in the past is the Brotherhood in the Atlanta Cafe. That's kind of like what we are with the Highline. Somebody has to run the boat in the winter. I would much rather have the Highline's boat stuck in the ice in Hyannis than us. That's their risk. That's their choice. They've made the aluminum lifeline investment. We made the steel lifeline investment. And we're about to make another $35 million steel investment along with all the other things that we're doing. They have their investment that is now become the slow boat. And that's just the way it is. I don't know what to say about the airport. I mean, I don't have the answer. I know that private planes and regional service is the future. I mean, you don't have to graduate Harvard to figure that out. That's pretty much the case. I remember when we were complaining about Cessnas. I haven't seen an airplane noise sticker in a long time. So the other thing is the maintenance. They have to have 3 boats. Doesn't matter how big they are. If they bought another boat long before we knew that the fast boats were the slow boat, we probably wouldn't even be here right now. They would already have had 3 boats. We wouldn't have the Lady Martha trying to run the Nantucket route in March and February. and they'd probably be selling a fast boat, getting another one, or something like that. But right now, because they only have two, and one inadequate, it's really 5 years late that this is even happening. So it's just it's become this normal mode of transportation that's taken, basically, I would say, since 2006 is when things really started to change, when people started using the baggage carts, going shopping. That's your Stop and Shop competition, is the fast boat baggage cart, just so you know. And that's just how it works. I mean, it's just what people do. Parking, people have cars everywhere over there. People borrow other people's cars. It's the system of each individual Nantucketer that has created this, other than just the sports teams. It's just become normal. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm going to ask if anybody else has any comment before we resume discussion on the commission. All right. Thank you. Mrs. Topham?
I just want to respond a little bit to Mr. Lowell. I think as an airport commission, we do have a fiscal responsibility to the town of Nantucket. I mean, you know what's been happening for the years. And I do think that a transportation, maybe committee, maybe not a board or whatever, maybe like we're doing today is talking. Maybe we need to sit down and talk, and maybe you could help resolve us. And one little aside, in 1955, we had football and basketball, and that was it.
I agree.
And we stayed overnight.
I agree. Peanut bus service in Woods Hole.
Yep.
You know, and I respectfully agree with you, and I should have maybe worded it a little differently. I'm not against I just get nervous when we start making policies.
Right.
I mean, having a discussion and a conversation like we're having, like with the tank farm, for example, it's an interesting dynamic because we had the freight shed in 1983, Jeanette. Amazing, isn't it? 1983. Trippy was down there picking stuff up inside of a building, okay? So that's how far we've come. The boat moved to Hyannis year-round in 1980. It's just, we've sort of like been sleeping all this time, and now it's like we're talking about it. And that's a good thing to have that conversation. But as far as policy goes, I think the policy has already happened.
Right. I agree.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nat.
Mr. Planzer?
Thank you. Mr. Lowell, so let me just say that I found that a very entertaining and interesting presentation, and I think it was very effective. I wanted to talk to you about the restaurant versus transportation policy. There are a few things that are different. The island, it is dependent on those two portals. Both of those they're not independent entrepreneurial places. The airport and the Steamship Authority are government-run entities. They are run for the betterment of the community. So the subsidies that the airport gets, whether it's from the Federal Aviation Administration to improve the safety, a control tower, whether it's to build a new terminal, whether it's to repair the macadam on the runways, is done not as an entrepreneurial entity. It's done for the betterment of the community, as is the Steamship Authority. The Steamship Authority is there to serve the ability to sustain the island. When you look at those two policies, if you were to draw them in a Venn diagram, they overlap in certain areas. So we know that there's a lot of stress on the downtown area based on parking. People leaving their cars there overnight for long periods of time, and how do they manage that? We know that the Board of Selectmen have chosen to do some parking offsets in order to help establish it. We know that the airlines also have parking issues, and that the airport could improve the parking capability to improve the experience, that in addition to the downtown area, can pull some of those overnight vehicles away. What I'm asking for, or what I think we should request a look at, similar to what Commissioner Topham was saying, is for us to discuss how they can blend together, not fixing competition, not saying we have to have X many on the Highline, X many on the steamship, and X many on the airlines, or the different various airlines. I think just a conversation along those lines would not in any way affect the competitive advantages and disadvantages that currently exist between commercial users of the airlines and also commercial users of the ferry. A transportation policy the conversation doesn't begin by saying this is the policy. It begins by saying what is best in our serving of the overall year-round and summer residents of Nantucket. On a subsidy issue, which is mentioned in the letter, we understand that there is a subsidy that is paid to the Steamship Authority from Highline, and I think it's justified. Makes a lot of sense. We also have to understand that there is a subsidy to not only from the federal government and the Department of Transportation in Massachusetts, but the summer residents, those big airplanes that replace the Cessnas, are carrying the overwhelming burden of the cost of that airport. That's not a bad thing, by the way. It is not the employments of commercial residents that's paying for that airport. It's the large, heavy corporate aircraft that use there. So all I'm asking for in this letter, I would like us to talk about working as a community to develop a positive outcome for our citizens year-round in particular. It's pretty tough here for people to get on and off the island year-round. I in no way want to inhibit the commercial or the competition of the groups. And I would argue that the airport can do a lot to help the airlines that operate here, but it's not our job to block what is best for the community, for the airport in favor of the steamship, or the steamship in favor of the airline. So there is it's different than a restaurant where there's 80 of them.
My point was on the restaurants, I always try to make an analogy because it's not that easy to talk about some of these things in a short amount of time, like a quick meeting like this. But they were self-regulated in that way, meaning several years ago, for example, okay, there's been, and I get asked this question about once a month, why don't you run an early trip? Because if we run an early trip, we'll lose money, and Highline will make barely any money on their first trip. So why would we want to do that? So it's a complicated discussion. So I was just trying to give you something that everybody sort of sees and they can use when they're driving down the street. This is very difficult to talk about. Like, for example, the Steamship Authority is the only transportation system that's public that's not subsidized. Another unique situation where we pay for our boat. And the Nantucket route, in fact, we just got our cost of service analysis in our mail this week. Nantucket pays for this route. It's kind of scary to look at the numbers. But in the past, we didn't, okay? And a lot of dynamics have changed over the last 10 or 12 years with the steamship to get the vineyard and the steamship, Nantucket, somewhat on even footing. During that entire time, the fast ferries have become standard transportation all around all these issues.
Okay, I'm going to cut this off, if I may, because I think we're getting into some repetition here. And I'd like to give the other commissioners a chance to say anything if they'd like to, and I would like to say something as well. Anybody else? Do you have anything else you'd like to say?
I would just express appreciation to all of the speakers, and it certainly helps, move and form my opinion from sort of where I started, and thank you very much.
Mr. Cunningham? You have to come over here.
Good afternoon. I'm Tom Cunningham, and I'm the principal behind Island Airlines and Ocean Wings and Cape and Island Air Freight. I don't have a solution for us. I would suggest to you that unlike a restaurant, we're a regulated industry and we couldn't close in the winter. I would like to. No offense to my neighbors, but if I didn't have to open from the day after the stroll until the middle of April, that would be lovely. The FAA would take a dim view of that. You guys would probably take a dim view too. I don't have the luxury of discussing with Cape Air when their schedule's going to be, whether they're going to leave a little before me, a little after me, whether they're going to reduce their schedule or increase their schedule. I don't have that luxury. I have the luxury of competing in a free market with Cape against two operators who are cooperative. I'm not complaining. What I'm suggesting is that as an airport commission, you should recognize that my passenger count in the first quarter was down 30% from last year. It's not sustainable. To the extent that we are going to continue to see the erosion in passengers in the off-season, the season, my guess is we'll see a fairly robust pickup, but it will be down from last year. We've invested, we'll take the risk, whether we should have or we shouldn't have. We've invested millions of dollars in our case, in the caravans, because we thought they were appropriate upgrade in service, for which we get nothing. We can't charge more, we don't get subsidized, and we surely don't get a reduction in our fees. Actually, the caravan, which carries the same number of people, goes the same speed, has a higher landing fee than the predecessor. So our fees are up. We're facing passenger facility charges. We're facing higher DOT fees. We have higher landing fees for the airplanes that we've spent more money on, and we have fewer passengers. I'm not complaining. I'm just telling you that's what's happening, and my guess is that you'll see less and less scheduled service here than you have seen in the past, and therefore we probably need to think about what that means for this airport. It's my livelihood. It's a little disheartening to try to chase these passengers, but frankly, we can only do so much. We have to pay for parking on both sides. They get free parking on this side if they take the boat, and they get to park in the town lot. Do I think that's fair? I would suggest to you I don't think that's fair. I don't understand it, but I'm not asking you guys to eliminate the cost of parking, because you charge for parking, and so does the new airport on the other side, which it didn't used to do. And people then look around and go, why is the passenger count down by 40% over the last several years? Partially, it's because the fast ferry is great service. I'll tell you it's great service. But we're on the verge of it being the only service. That's not that's just, I think that's a fact. I think you just have to ask yourself, how long if we see increased fees from a regulated industry and increased costs to do business between the two airports, whether it's parking or PFCs or greater fees or greater tax rates, couple that, there is no surprise why we have lower passenger counts. And you have an alternative, which is a great service from the Highline and the Steamship, and I don't begrudge them that. They do get to coordinate their service, but shoot, if they were just the Steamship, they'd be doing it by themselves anyway. So that's my comments. Any questions?
No, thank you.
Mr. Planzer?
And I agree with you, it is a reset, but it is.
So,
every time we do it, it's a reset.
So thank you. I think it's great. I was wondering if one of the commercial carriers were going to come. So I think a couple of points that you made. Number one, I didn't hear anything you said that spoke against the transportation policy, that took a look at taking care of the community, both air and sea. I'm not sure you shouldn't be asking for us to work the parking issue. I'm not sure you shouldn't be talking to us about the landing fees. Those are things that we control in the community. And it is, I believe, as important to have island air going back and forth, arguably maybe more important than adding more and more ferry service. But I do believe your point about you're willing to compete on an even playing field. I don't necessarily think that you have an even playing field. I do believe you don't. One of the reasons you don't is we don't have that transportation policy. There are things that the Airport Commission can do about parking that draws the community to that experience at the airport that is better than it is today. And I think that we have a great airport. I think you provide great service. I think the Caravan, from a passenger standpoint, is great. I'm not so sure it's working for you economically, but that's your decision, not mine. I would like to see us helping to level the playing field. In order to do that, we have to have a transportation policy that says certain types of parking are reduced, certain landing fees are reduced. They're not fixed in stone. They are not something that can't be changed and adjusted as long as the adjustment is for the betterment of the community. So I maybe you're not asking enough.
I think we're getting a little far afield here of what, this is
Is that
something
a question?
No? That was it. By the way, Mr. Chairman, I'm not sure we're getting far.
No,
afield.
I meant,
think
I'm
these
sorry, I meant it in the
conversations are important.
I meant in the context of, they're very important. One of the problems is, however, here is we only have, a few hours to come to a conclusion on the immediate question before us. How we ultimately respond is something we can spend some more time on, that will come up in our discussion of the master plan and so forth. But right now, the issue is whether the commission takes some action to suggest that the formulation of a policy and the possible delaying of activity by the Steamship Authority is the appropriate course that we're dealing with right now. I'd like to comment on the fact that it was brought up earlier that this is all private enterprise. Well, I respectfully disagree. The Steamship Authority was created because private enterprise didn't work at that point. It wasn't working at that point. It couldn't do it. Now, granted, things have changed a lot in the last 40 years, 50 years, 60 years that it's been since the Steamship Authority was created. The population of the island has grown, but a lot of the people who come over here to work on a daily basis on the Highline come in because of the people who fly in the big private jets to Nantucket Airport, and so everything is very interrelated here. And I don't have a particular axe to grind personally in this. I don't know what the ultimate answer is. The ultimate answer may be that airport, suck it up and, deal with your future without airplane service to Hyannis. And I can live with that if that's what the community tells us it wants. Excuse me, Mr. Planzer. From my perspective, this is a dialogue which we should, because of these reset buttons, which the Steamship Authority has essentially taken for granted over the last 20 years, and their ability to do this, which, I don't argue with that, but I think maybe it's time that there be a larger community dialogue on the resets that are going on, just so people have a chance to understand. And having a comment period, which admittedly was 2 weeks from the time the first publication, is not long enough for a community to be able to get its act together and decide what it wants to do. And that really is my position on this. I think that the transportation policy is, there are risks in it. There's no question. There are risks in it for everybody. And I don't argue that in fact, I commend both the Steamship and the Highline for their service. And throwing a monkey wrench in that works is not something that one should do lightly. But I think, again, from the standpoint of the overall picture of transportation to the island, my personal preference is that it be looked at, once that authority is given to build that boat, it's a done deal. And that is going to have the reset button is going to be hit, and the consequences will be what they may. All I'd like is a chance to understand make sure everybody understands as best they can what those consequences are before we go into it. Mr. Planzer.
I understand that, and I don't disagree with it. The Steamship Authority, the new boat, is not what will make or break whether you have air service to this community. The market forces will determine if you will always have air service, even if it has to go down to essential air service. But the community is expanding, so because we have so many people coming in and so many options, that the community isn't regulated in air that it must have service. I don't want it to be binary that says, if this boat is approved, we won't have any commercial air service to Hyannis. I understood, sir, the Island Air's concerns. I did. I understood that very well. But I don't think they are quite that binary. There are things that we can do to help the airlines create and improve the service that the passengers have to make the airlines more desirable, especially the short haul to Hyannis. I simply would like the letter to be clear on whatever points it wants to make. And I think I heard 3 points. One that I proposed, we want a transportation policy. I heard Ms. Topham say we should have a discussion about that. And Mr. Drake, I heard you say that we should have a longer period to comment on the proposal that the Steamship Authority and Highline are proposing. If those are the 3 things the letter is going to ask for, I'm okay. But if the letter is going to say, don't build another ship to meet the requirements of the community, I'm reluctant to agree to that. But the other 3 things, I think, make a lot of sense. Transportation policy, a forum for discussion, and a longer period for the community, not for us, but for the community to comment, I don't think is unreasonable, and it can be done within that year time frame before you go to the Tier 4 engines. I think you have enough time. We're talking weeks, not months.
Well, the letter asks for 2 things. The preamble may not be exactly perfect, but the letter asks for 2 things in the resolution, as I understand them. One of them is that the Board of Selectmen of the town undertake to prepare and adopt a transportation policy, and that the Steamship Authority agree. Again, both of these are voluntary. We can't force anybody to do anything. That the Steamship Authority agree to postpone for a year, as it's drafted here, its decision on this. So I don't think that's really very different from what you're talking about. My concern is, as I said before, if they go ahead and authorize that boat now, whatever the consequences may be, are going to happen regardless.
And I think there is a little difference. What I heard, and I'm taking what our colleagues have given us on face value. I have no reason to disagree with them. The year part is what's going to be a problematic piece for them because of the engine changes. Did I get that correct?
All types of costs related to
So I'm simply saying let's get the comment period up and running. Let the community decide what they want. Maybe you need more than 2 weeks. I'm not talking about a year. I'm thinking you have to extend the period a little more reasonably. I didn't see this letter till an hour before we got here, so I'd have to spend a little more time on that. I read it as quick as I could, Mr. Chairman. I think those 3 things are not in dispute. Transportation policy, time to comment, and a discussion forum in which it can be discussed.
I originally drafted this letter with a 6-month period in it. The initial request to the board was slightly different. And my reaction and my reason I changed it, I'd be perfectly happy to move it back to 6 months or even 3 months if I thought it was realistic to expect that the town could come up with a transportation policy in that period of time. I don't. I'm not sure it's even realistic to expect it will happen in a year, but the reason I worded it as it is in order to give the authority some room to go ahead should there be no action on putting together a transportation policy. Again, this is outside. We're asking for something. How it plays out from here is beyond our control. And so that's the reason for the year that's in here. I understand the implications, but part of the problem is we're just hearing about these now. If we'd heard about these 6 months ago, or because I know these discussions have been going on for a lot longer than a couple of months or a few months. If the community had had a chance to input then, it would have been a lot better than it is now. We're under the gun. The community's under the gun.
One more point and then I'll move along. They are related to each other, those 3 points. They are not integrated with each other. So I don't think you could get a transportation in 3 months either. And I don't think you'd want to create one that didn't have a well-thought-out basis for it. The transportation policy is not based on whether or not you get a new ferry for the Highline. It's the ancillary issues that level the playing field that the transportation policy would cover.
The practical implication here is that we have 3 days. Anybody has 3 days now to get in comments. The Board of Selectmen is discussing this tomorrow night. If they choose to comment and to carry it any further, then they have 2 days to get that to the Steamship Authority, and the Steamship Authority will agree or not agree to go along with that. Mr. Atherton?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. My name is Rick Atherton, and I sit on that Board of Selectmen. Just one thing in listening to this, which has been a great conversation, I don't come away with a good sense, and maybe you all do, as to the sort of hardcore capacity numbers and the number of trips in a simple, easily understandable way for me to grasp that. In other words, I don't sense whether we're talking about another 1,000 passengers per month in capacity at the Highline or none, just in a simple way. And the same, so I don't have a good feel for, I think I heard, how many, 35% down or whatever? 2 more 35s and we really are in difficulty at the airport. So some of those numbers would help me if they were just on a consolidated sheet of paper to show the air taxi, the steamship, the slow ferry and the fast ferry, and the Highline numbers, just as we go forward. I think there are issues here about subsidies in lots of different ways. In a sense, the Highline license fee is sort of like a subsidy in a way. It's coming from the private sector to the public sector, just as the FAA are. I think the town is involved in some subsidies for the Highline through the parking issues, which I think we need to think through consciously, and whether or not we ought to look to the Highline or to some other party to help us more openly in that issue. I don't know. But I'm just giving you some thoughts that hit me quickly. It's going to be difficult for us in our meeting tomorrow night to have the fullness of the discussion you've had here. I might encourage my members to watch, but it's unlikely we're going to be able to go through that dialogue. So a week or two, if it doesn't hurt your schedules, I think would be helpful for everybody. And it would be nice if people got on board with that, independent of a year. Clearly, we're not going to accomplish something in a year. I mean, I don't mind having a transportation policy discussion, but I'm just being realistic politically. It's unlikely the board is going to want to delay a public hearing for more than a couple of weeks to let the decision get made on the boat. So just my observations, because I have another meeting. Thanks.
All right, just one, before you go, Rick, quickly, one other thing, slightly off topic, but Mr. Rafter, would you relate your interactions with the manager of the Barnstable Airport on this subject, please?
Well, they were very interested. They weren't aware of the notice, and they were going to be discussing it, I believe, tomorrow at their, they have a subcommittee meeting, their finance committee tomorrow, and they're going to be discussing that because, they have similar type concerns, I think.
Well, I would think they would. And I think the town of Barnstable ought to be as interested in their airport. And it may be that the taxis are more important to the Barnstable airport than they are to us. I don't sense they have as many private jets flying into Hyannis to pay the freight. But I don't know the facts about that. The Barnstable Town Council might want to be interested as well. I don't know whether their airport's running an easy balance or a surplus or what their problems are, but there's an impact on all of us through all of these changes that are occurring. So, again, 2 weeks for Barnstable to have the same dialogue would be helpful. Okay.
Thank you. Ms. Toppin?
May I ask, maybe Mr. Sayers and/or Mr. Riley, what would be a length of time that you would be allowed or would be agreeable to? Would another month to get public discussion? And there was something else that whatchamacallit said. I don't necessarily agree with the transportation policy as much as I agree with the discussion, because I don't think we have time to set up a transportation policy. I just think if we could have a good discussion with Board of Selectmen and whomever else is involved or interested, boards, not the community.
Right.
But
And the discussion will generate the considerations that the policy will hopefully address
Yes.
later. I was just talking to not my direct boss, but one of my bosses, Mr. Ranney, and as far as we, as the Steamship Authority is concerned, we have no need to make this decision by Friday or by next Tuesday. The only consideration may be Highline's need to get a rather swift decision so they can lock in costs, because by the current license agreement, they cannot enter into any contract for a new boat until they get our permission. But we do have our regular monthly meeting. It may be well attended next month on Nantucket, by coincidence, on the third Tuesday of the month. I don't know what day of the month that is, but it's always the third Tuesday. And given Mr. Atherton's suggestion and what I've been hearing from all of the commissions here, it might make, certainly, we would have no concern about postponing that, extending the public comment period so we have more time and having a decision be made with all considerations. If it meets Highline's needs, and I can't answer that, that would have to be up to Marty, and I don't even know whether he can answer that today because he has to check with the Scudder family. But I know that we're both planning to be at the Selectmen's meeting tomorrow at 6 o'clock, and Murray Scudder will also be there, and we might be able to talk between now and then and see if that's a possibility.
may I ask, excuse me, please,
Mrs. Toppin?
where, Mr. Sayers, where your meeting is held now? Steamship Authority meetings are held, if it's on Nantucket?
Well, it has for the last several years been held at the Nantucket Whaling Museum in the Discovery Room. I don't think that room will be large enough if this is going to be a subject of discussion there. So we would have to consider, this is a lovely space here. And, we would have to ask, in the past, we've held meetings at the high school. You know as well as I do where we've held the meetings at a number of places. And this is the first time I've been in this building, and this could be a consideration. We would have to work that out.
You could even start televising your meetings.
Actually, we do.
They do on
We do have
mainland,
someone who videographs them, and they are televised on the Vineyard and in New Bedford, but Nantucket hasn't. Maybe Nantucket will have more interest.
Thank you very much.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to respond to, I had to say hello to the chairman for a minute. Murray Scudder will be there tomorrow, and I will be there as well. And all I can say is that there has been a tremendous amount of support for the proposal on the island. And time is somewhat...
Could you quantify that a little more? How you mean in response to the comment?
Public comment has been overwhelmingly favorable.
Is that 10 letters to one letter, 100 letters to...
You can speak to that a little bit better than I, but it's been overwhelmingly favorable.
I took the liberty of putting my boss's email address in the public notice. If you notice, Wayne Lamson's email address. And we did not get, in full disclosure, Highline sent apparently an e-blast to its customers on Friday at some point.
I got it.
All right, so I'm not, and we have gotten probably...
I wondered why it hadn't come out 2 weeks before, but I got it.
And we have gotten probably around 50 emails in response to that, and they are overwhelmingly in favor. I will be candid. They are overwhelmingly in favor. There have been some who have questioned whether Strait Wharf has the capacity to handle the discharge of that many passengers at once. It did in the old days, by the way, when the Great Point carried that many passengers. It hasn't seen that number of passengers at any recent times, but that was of concern the last time, we have had these public comment periods. No one ever really commented in the past, which is why we thought 2 weeks would be adequate again, because 2 weeks has always been adequate in the past.
Sometimes it takes us a long time to wake up out here.
And so those have been some concerns, but I would say probably only from 2 people out of the 50, and some people have expressed concern about the airlines, the effect on the airlines.
Thank you.
The other comment on that is that, we want to be respectful of what the sentiments of the island are, but the issue of the importance of trying to move forward as quickly as possible to get the authorization to build the boat is very important for not only Highline but for the island, because interest rates continue to be very favorable. The engine requirements are very significant, the costs associated with those changes. So every day that we wait is an adverse thing. The Lady Martha is totally inadequate in the winter, so there's a lot of...
Mr. Riley, I don't think anybody is arguing the point with you. All we are suggesting, we're going to come up with a conclusion here, I hope, in a few minutes, but all I am suggesting is that we should have had this dialogue a lot sooner than it's been brought to the public's attention. And as I say, I wondered, frankly, why the public notice thing was out there for a couple of weeks, but your blast came 3 days or a week before the comment period was up.
Yeah, and we really haven't, to be honest with you, as the authority could attest to, in previous efforts when we've gone forward to do these things, we have brought in broad-based support through a comprehensive grassroots mobilization, coalition building effort. We haven't even attempted to do that. One of the reasons is we obviously, as one of the Jeanette represented, we've been dealing with some extenuating circumstances that we dealt with over the last couple of months. But we're very happy to work with the island because I'm confident that the overwhelming sentiment will be tremendously supportive of this proposal. So whatever the decision is,
as long as people understand what the
it.
proposal is all about and
Right.
what the potential implications are, I have no
Right.
problem with that.
And as we said today, it's not an increase in service. We're replacing a 720-foot, 20-passenger traditional
All right, okay.
antiquated
Thank
boat
you.
with a new
We've
boat.
been through all that. Thank you
Okay.
very much.
Just for the record, that's all.
Thank you.
What's the pleasure of the commission? Does anybody want to make a motion?
Well, and I would suggest we divide it up, the different issues.
That's fine. Go ahead. Go ahead. However you want to.
For instance, like asking the Board of Selectmen for consideration of a transportation policy, but not necessarily tying that to holding up the decision on the license or whatever. And then I guess do a vote on whether we ask the Board of Selectmen to, or asking the Steamship to hold off on their decision, or to give more comment period, I guess. And also, I guess, what we would be asking if we did ask.
Okay. Maybe it would be helpful to have a motion so we can talk from that, talk from something specific rather than.
Well, let me throw one out and see if it generates the conversation. First one is that we request that the Steamship Authority, the Highline, extend the notice period by 30 days.
It's actually got to be a little longer than that. Well, if it goes out to the 17th of June, 'cause it should be the Friday before that, I presume.
So that
It'd
time
be
frame.
similar to what was here. I don't know if it's 30 days or 32 days or
Okay,
whatever.
so let's take a calendar and one. So the first motion is that we adjust an extension of approximately 30 days based on the calendar. The second motion is we ask the.
All right, let's do one at a time.
And I'll second that motion.
That date, if we're talking about the 17th, that date would be if it's consistent with what we've done and makes sense to you all, that date would be the 13th of June, Friday the 13th.
Excuse me, Mr. Chair, other than being superstitious, we made it this Friday only because of the short time constraints. Because I would appreciate it if we made it Thursday, June 12th, because that's when the administration gets out the recommendation and gets the package out to the board, so they have.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
Okay, and that would be, we're asking the Board of Governors.
We're asking the Board of Governors to
To-
extend their decision to allow a comment period expiring June 12th.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
I made the motion, so,
And I seconded.
and Ms. Topham seconded it.
And do you have it, Ms. Torres? Is there further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Those opposed? It carries unanimously. Is there a further motion?
Yes. Again, let me put it out there so we can get it. That we make, the Airport Commission makes a motion to the Board of Selectmen to set up a ad hoc group made up of the Airport Commission and several,
We can't tell them who to put on it. We can tell them who we think should go on it, but we can't tell them who to put on it.
thank you for that, that we would recommend that that ad hoc commission include the Steamship Authority. It would include the Highline. It would include the Island Air, Cape Air, and Nantucket Airlines that provide service back and forth from the island to Hyannis. I think Cape Air isn't included in that. Yeah, they do. So those three. With the intent to have that group work for 6 months to present a recommendation to the Board of Selectmen for an overall transportation policy.
Is there a second to that motion?
I'll second that.
Is there discussion?
I have some discussion.
Yeah, Mr. Gasparo?
I'm wondering if that might be just a little premature. If maybe, since the comment period is extended, maybe that's something that could be addressed at our next meeting. In other words, it doesn't have to happen
Oh, I see.
right now. We can maybe further refine. Part of my thinking on the transportation policy and planning is that we are in the master plan process, and that it could be something that our recommendation could be sort of further refined instead of just on the fly here. Just, I'm not necessarily opposed, but that's my thoughts possibly on it, and I'm not saying I would vote against it, but I just think that mostly just a little bit of time, and the fact that the next steamship, I really like that to see that decision made on Nantucket, respectful to the time of the Highline. I don't think that, I would hope that helps to balance all of the sort of interests.
I agree with that, because there's no,
Mr. Chairman, based on Mr. Gasparo's dialogue, I'd like to withdraw that motion. I would like to withdraw that motion. I would like to
Mr.
make...
Seconder, agree to that?
oh, yes.
I'd like to just make a comment that when we do have that dialogue, it is much broader than just the steamship versus the commercial airline carriers. It has to include parking, landing fees, all of those things all those ancillary things that drive the experience that we control. I don't want to get into steamships details, but our transportation policy should cover, and things like if the community is going to set up a parking capability for the Steamship Authority, and I don't oppose that, but then they have to take a look at what our parking is at the airport, and how do we fit into that? How do we support Island Air, as an example, in driving the capabilities for them to utilize the airport more effectively? I just like that as a comment, Mr. Gasparo, but based on your comment, I agree with you.
I'm very troubled by this lack of action, frankly, because I think we can sit and basically put our heads in the sand, in my view, and say, all right, we can tell them to delay by 30 days. What's that gain? It's not really going to gain anything. The selectmen could turn around tomorrow and say they want them to delay it for 30 days, and that's fine, but the end of the result is going to be the same. The Steamship Authority is going to approve the Highline's license. I sound like I'm being presumptuous, but I think that is pretty much the fact. And it's going to go ahead and happen. We don't understand the implications of it. We can say one thing, we can say another thing. We really don't understand. The numbers that we have in our possession are pretty much useless from this standpoint, because unfortunately we didn't keep numbers on trips to particular destinations until 2011 or 2012. Let's talk about this being a reset. I believe it is a major reset, and I believe we, as a public agency, the Steamship Authority as a public agency, and particularly the Board of Selectmen as a public entity, have a responsibility to the overall community to understand, as public agencies and as fiduciaries of their particular spheres, to understand what's happening here. Because certainly if we'd understood what was happening in 1998, we wouldn't have spent $30 million on a new terminal, I don't think. And I don't think Hyannis would have spent $30 million on a new terminal. That's speculation. I wasn't part of the decision process, but given what I've seen, whatever thinking there was at that time was pretty specious or pretty superficial. So I believe, if it's the will of the commission, fine. I will get up at the meeting tomorrow night and speak as a private citizen, because I believe we've got to understand what's happening and decide how we want to deal with that before anybody, whether it be us or the Steamship Authority or the town in terms of parking and all that, really know what's going on. Does anybody else want to say anything? Make a motion or not? I guess we're done with the subject then. Thank you. Thank you all for coming. Appreciate it. And we do, yeah. I'm just thanking them. They don't have to stay if they don't want to. We'll move on to our other item, which is the formerly used defense site status. Mr. Rafter, do you want to bring us up to date?
We've had a follow-up conference call with the Army Corps of Engineers, the DEP, and our attorney, and they are proceeding with, I believe they were supposed to issue last week an RFP for the consultant to have them on board and have some sort of an action plan together, hopefully by the end of this year, early next year. They're looking at award, I believe, in another couple of months, and then work towards the action plan. That action plan would then give us much better information as to what is what the work plan will be and what potential impacts there may be on our existing tenants. If I may, I'd like to split this into two different categories. That was what I'll call the FUDs, for lack of a better term, right now. The other was the testing of the stockpile, where we had Weston come out and do some testing, and we did find some elevated...
This is the stockpile on air...
That was moved from Bunker Road to the airport.
Mm-hmm.
And there was one reportable event of metals that were elevated, and we have notices going out to the tenants today indicating exactly what that was and what directions they're supposed to take in regard to that, as well as the FUDs and updating them on the FUDs. As I just said, the update on the funding, the timing, and where we're going forward, where they're not supposed to be disturbing any of the soil or anything else. And again, a very good conversation with the Army Corps, very positive. They played it down quite a bit in terms of an overall munitions site, in that based on the information they have, they don't believe this in their context, if you will, to be a major issue. So they kind of made it sound like it was a smaller of all the types that they've ever had to deal with. So But again, it has to go through the formal process and just will take quite a bit of time. As I say, it will take probably at least a year before the analysis is completed, and then it could take up to another 2 years for the actual remediation to occur. So looking at that time period, our attorney has essentially recommended with the leases that we do not have, that we haven't engaged in, that we cancel the procurement because of the duration it's going to take, that they would become stale.
All right, well, let's talk about, we have a notice here that's going out, that council has drafted, that's going out to the existing tenants. And, unless somebody sees something, because council has drafted it, unless somebody sees something that's a major issue, I think normally this would not, I think, fall under the purview of the commission, but it's something that I think is important enough that you should be aware of it and have the chance to ask any questions about it.
Dan, if I may, just for clarification also, we refer, and I may use the terminology Bunker Road tenants. I'm referring to the ones that within the past year or so we've entered into leases with. There are some others that have been out there for 10 and 15 years. It doesn't have to deal with those. It has to deal with those that are in the area of concern.
All right, thank you. Are there any questions or comments? And I think on this first, you should just go ahead and send out the letter, Mr. After.
Okay.
On the issue of the procurement, the revocation of the procurement, do you want to give a little of the background there in terms of the conversations with council? Or do you want me to?
Well, just as I said, we went through the process, and council went through it council was on the call with DEP and Army Corps, and, we were making every effort to try to find out, okay, what can we do, what should we do, and is there another way to accommodate this? Unfortunately, because of the way the procurement is, his recommendation is that the time frame and everything, it will be stale, and that because of the procurement laws, we should, whatever his terminology was,
revoke
the procurement. We are looking through the master plan effort at potential alternative sites. Unfortunately, there's nothing that is available today that we could immediately do without either a new procurement and or some other land use changes. But we're looking to see if we can accommodate. We don't want to lose a tenant, but we're going to try to see if we can accommodate this. It's just that it's not an easy, quick fix. Just pick it up and move it somewhere else.
And there are two prospective tenants who are involved in this, are there not?
That's correct.
Mr. Smith, Mr. Cohen, do you want to say anything on this?
Yes, please. Mr. Chairman, I would agree with the airport commissioner and town council in principle that the airport should be respecting the 30B rules and should be making sure that any bids that are awarded are compliant and are defensible. And I'd also suggest that obviously public safety is a primary concern, and to the extent that the airport is acting financially responsibly, that's also an important concern. I think what's being missed here is that the flood site is 500 acres, and the investigation site is 2 acres, and these sites that we're talking about being led are only 1.2 acres, and what's the other one? 1 acre. And the investigation site and the lease areas are different. And what my client is suggesting, and I think would be responsible for you to do if the Army Corps of Engineers confirmed it, is to allow for private testing of the lease areas that would be much faster, that would save the airport money, would allow the airport to start generating revenue, and would have no threat to public health or safety. If the investigation determines that there is an issue, cancel it then.
If I may,
sure.
If I can just jump in here. We basically approached that with the Army Corps on our conference call.
Yeah.
And the area of concern is not actually delineated to any specific points. We've been trying to get them to do that.
Right.
When we approached this subject and basically went through just what you did and said, well, what if, we had somebody else come in and do that? They essentially told us that we then accept all liability for the entire area of concern, the 2 acres or whatever it is, whatever may be in there.
Right.
So while they're playing it down, the worst-case scenario is it could be an actual munitions dump, which could require millions of dollars of cleanup.
Right. And obviously, the airport should not engage in any activity that put that liability on you. I guess what I'm confused about is that what we heard when we talked to the Army Corps of Engineers is the opposite. I have an email from Heather Sullivan at the Army Corps of Engineers that says the opposite of that they would have no problem with a private investigation, that it would not endanger future financing and those kind of things. So someone is not getting the right information. And if it turns out that it's us, that's fine. You guys should not engage in anything that endangers funding, brings you liability, any of those kind of things. But what I'd like to do is if we could get a formal letter from the Army Corps just taking a position one way or the other. I think that my client and the airport would like to see private money saving the airport money. I think you'd like to see a tenant and those kind of things. And if that can happen, great. And if it can't because of too much time is going to pass, or there's some kind of liability or for financial risk or safety risk, that's fine too. But if I could make a request that you delay your decision until you get something in writing from the Corps, just taking a position on that, I think it'd be responsible, and we certainly appreciate it.
If I'm not mistaken, we've requested that in writing from the Corps, and they have not provided it. They would not provide it to us. So if you have anything to the contrary, I'd be very happy to take a look at that.
Sure, I could give you the email now. But.
Hang on. Mr. Blanchard?
Yes. What I heard Mr. Cohen say is they have an email from a person within the Army Corps that told them that it would be, my words, okay. Can we get a copy of that? Sure. And then we can send a note asking for confirmation that this would not be detrimental for the reasons that Mr. Cohen stated to the airport. If we should theoretically be able to get that in 2 weeks, send an email, theoretically get it in the same day. And if we don't, there's a time, I don't think the 2 weeks makes a difference. Why don't we at least try to accommodate the request? If we can't, we can't.
Yeah, and I think something like that's perfectly reasonable. That's all we're looking for is something like that.
Excuse me, is this a name that rings a bell?
It's the lady we've been talking to, and that's why I'm quite frankly dumbfounded because, and no, I'm going to look to you to say, did I miss a portion of this conversation somewhere?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really short blurb. I could read it if you want. Heather says, I want to summarize our discussion earlier today. All of the Fuzz property is over 500 acres. The only project we currently have is the 2-acre MRS. The 2-acre site will be focused on remedial investigation. We do not anticipate our project going beyond the 2 acres. The funding will be secured for the investigation, and any additional testing done by private parties will not affect future funding at the work at the site. If testing is done privately, we ask that the results be provided to us to incorporate into our investigation, our being the Army Corps of Engineers. We do not see any issue with the use of the 2-acre site while we are doing our investigation, as long as we have access when we do need to do our field work. Excavation activities should be limited to the 2 acres MRS site to the extent possible until we are done with our investigation. Our investigation will be limited to the 2-acre site. Therefore, activities on other portions of the property can continue without impacting our funding or the project. Please let me know if you have any additional information or questions.
Has she been able to identify the 2-acre site?
What do you mean?
Where is it? Where are the boundaries? I have not been able to do that, and we couldn't get it from. That's why I'm not being smart, Steve.
Yeah, no, listen.
You have more information right there than we've been trying to get.
Let's not make him answer their question. I think we can send a follow-up email attaching that one saying.
Sure. I'd like to get a copy of that.
Tom, I'm not trying to embarrass you. I'm just trying to say.
Let's just give us the email, please.
Sure.
And
we'll follow up with it.
Right. This is moments old. So if they have.
I would also be interested if you wouldn't mind sharing with us what you sent her.
Sure. Yeah, I could send you both the 2 and the front. Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, we're not hiding anything. We don't.
I mean, because it is, as you can tell, a surprise to us.
Right. It was a surprise to us. We were very pleased.
I'm sure you were.
I will forward this to Mr. Rafter, and if he sends it along with some supplemental questions and gets back a confirmation of what we'd like to happen, that's great. We'd like to move forward. If she backtracks and says, "Oh no, that there's the liability issue. I didn't mention that," or whatever. If we get a negative response, we get a negative response. But if it's okay, I think we and the airport would want to move forward.
That's fine. I agree. It's new information.
Right.
Because our understanding up to now is that would not be the case.
Sure.
So-
And based on negative information, you should have a negative recommendation. I agree with that. I just would appreciate you taking 2 weeks or a month to just confirm a final answer from them.
Mrs. Top?
I have a comment. If it's only minutes old, as you indicated, Mr. Cohen, perhaps yours is home on your at your office on your computer.
I hope.
That would be nice. That's just a comment.
Yeah.
All right.
Positive thought.
So if you wouldn't mind, putting it off for
We'll put it off until
you get
we get a answer back one way or the other.
Right. I appreciate that.
I mean, if they, again, what your magic is to get them to answer it, I don't know. But clearly, we don't have that same wand so
Mr.
far.
Smith is very charming.
We haven't had that same wand. So if we go back to them and a month from now they haven't responded.
Right. You need to take responsible positions, and I understand that. If we could just
And
get a
believe me,
clarification.
none of this we have rushed into. So
Listen, there are serious issues here with liability, with public safety, all kinds of things.
and incidentally, you understand that the pile that was tested was dirt that came from that site.
The 2-acre site.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I just
Yeah.
want to make sure you were clear on that.
Yeah, I am.
Yeah. Okay.
Nobody wants the financial or physical problems that could come with not acting responsibly here.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Cohen. All right. I guess we can
Motion to adjourn.
have a motion to adjourn.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Unanimous.
Do we have to
4:25.
4:30?
Yeah, we have to be out by 4:30, so.
Good timing.
Meetings of, I'd just like to apologize that Bobby couldn't make it because he had school.
Tell him we missed him.
We did have other members of the public, however.
So we're going to put him as absent today?
Yes.
So that all we have is copies of the TSA extension.
All right.